everybody, welcome to today's panel discussion. This has very kindly been organised by the Faculty of Humanities here at the University of Manchester. My name is Zara. I'm going to be your host for the next hour, and I work in the marketing and recruitment team within the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. So as some of you might know, tomorrow is World Sustainability Day. For those of you who don't know, it's an annual event to raise awareness about environmental issues and kind of promote sustainable practices. So we thought this event would tie in really nicely to that. And as I'm sure many of you know, this event today is about environmental equity, and we're basically looking to analyse kind of environmental injustice from a humanities perspective. So we have three wonderful academics from the Faculty of Humanities who will be kind of tackling these questions, these challenges from their own perspectives within their own fields. And I'll now pass on to them for some brief introductions. Sherilyn, you're first on my screen. Would you like to start and introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Sherilyn MacGregor, and I am a professor in the politics department. And shall I say a little bit about my research, just really briefly? So my research spans a number of different topics, but at the core of it is to investigate the links between environmental unsustainability and intersecting forms of social injustice, so and particularly gender and race and ethnicity. And all of my work is interested in trying to challenge assumptions and enable greater inclusivity, both in environmental policy making and as well as environmentalism as a social movement.
Fantastic, thanks, Sherilyn. Richard, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Just about good afternoon, everyone, if you're in the UK. So my name's Richard Kingston. I'm in the Department of Planning, Property and Environmental Management. That's in the School of Environment, Education and Development. I'm a professor of urban planning and what's called geographic information science, so computerized mapping. So I'm a town planner. That's my background. Trained as a professional planner. But probably about 20 years ago, I started to specialize in the role of sort of computerized mapping tools to support decision making, and particularly involving the general public in how they make decisions about environmental planning. So over the years, I've developed a lot of what we call spatial decision support systems, online mapping tools. One of those that's very relevant today that I'll probably mention a few times today is something called the Climate Just mapping tool, which was built in collaboration with what's called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Anastasia. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Really nice to be here. I'm Anastasia Valassopoulous, and I am a senior lecturer in world literatures in the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures in the Department of English, American Studies and Creative Writing. I think a few years ago, I would have felt really out of place on a panel such as this. But I think I just feel absolutely that we need to start looking at literature and cultural production that deals with these issues. And I had a nice, I can't show it to you now, but I have a very big pile of my books here, all testimony to the fact that we're trying to tackle this on the kind of very local level within our departments. And I teach a course called World Literature and Climate Crisis, which responds to many of the issues that I hope we'll discuss today. So thank you for the invitation.
We're so pleased to have all three of you. I think it'd be useful if we stuck to that same structure in terms of answering questions going forward. So the very first question, for people who might not know, how does your field tackle environmental injustice, and kind of what does your field define environmental injustice as?
Right, well, coming from environmental politics, I would sort of start the kind of explanation as thinking back in the history of environmental racism as a concept. And I would say probably about 30 years ago in the US, there was a joining up of the environmental movement and the civil rights movement, and people of color in deprived and underserved communities, particularly in the South of the United States, really wanted to challenge the fact that people of color and poor people lived in poor environments, and the fact that there's a deep structural injustice in the way that environmental sort of unwanted uses of land and factories and various sort of really unwanted uses and problematic environmental activities were cited in communities, poor communities of color, and making that connection and saying this is not fair, this is not just, prompted a social movement to try and put it on the agenda and do the kinds of research and claim making that was necessary to kind of draw attention to the issue politically. Over the last 30 years or so, this discourse, this set of arguments have broadened to become a much more intersectional and structural analysis of why it is that people with the least power in societies, due to their positions in gender, race, class, and so forth, hierarchies, have the least access to environmental goods, while at the same time being the least responsible for causing environmental bads, right? So then that is an injustice. It's really unfair if we think about the sort of theory of what it means to be just, or sort of, to be unjust is to be unfair. And it's very unfair that people who are in the minority, sort of that some peoples, a minority of people on the planet are able to enjoy a clean and healthy environment, whereas the vast majority are not. So there's a real sort of disparity in terms of the distribution of environmental goods and bads. So in my field of environmental politics, we want to try and theorize that through thinking about the concept of justice. We want to try to investigate the structural forces behind the root causes for this disparity and these inequalities, as well as thinking about what are the right types of answers to try to tackle that. And that may be around things like distributing wealth more fairly, distributing resources more fairly in society. So that's really looking at the way capitalism works. It may be thinking about changing the procedures and the processes of decision-making that lead to the citing of particular environmental uses and activities in places. So that's again about more inclusive and democratic decision-making, bringing more people into the procedure. And then finally, really has to be involved with trying to tackle the stigmas, the isms that mean that there are sort of structural reasons why certain groups of people are less valued and their voices are less heard and less accounted for within the processes. So tackling the isms of racism, sexism, etc. And so those are the kinds of things that we really want to look at, as well as certainly from my perspective, trying to do the kind of research that will support and enable campaigning organizations, people at the front lines of these struggles for recognition and for justice, helping them to be more effective in their claim making. I hope that is a good enough kind of beginning of an answer from my perspective.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Sherilyn. Really, really interesting to hear about from your perspective. Richard, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I agree entirely there with what Sherilyn was saying, and I think the reference there to sort of people of color and injustice in the United States, and what's called redlining, which I'm sure Sherilyn will be aware of, where they define neighborhoods, and they would be essentially redlined, where they put a red line on a map around those areas, and they then use that in planning processes to decide where they would allocate. And certainly certain older industries that were quite polluting would often be sited in those communities. So you're kind of essentially screwed from the point at which you're born and going forward. And whilst we've not had quite the same kind of approach to land use planning, and I'm obviously coming from the perspective of a planner in the UK, as someone who stares at maps a lot and analyzes data, when we start to look at the kind of socioeconomic data and the underlying population, we see a lot of similar patterns. More deprived neighborhoods, living closer to more polluting industries historically. If you look at things like respiratory illness and air pollution, it tends to follow the patterns of road networks, and you get more deprived communities living next to major roads and things. So for me, I mean, in terms of environmental injustice, I don't think you can really decouple this from wider social and other environmental injustices. They're all sort of linked together. And I guess that's partly why the work we did with Joseph Rowntree Foundation nearly 10 years ago now, but it's still ongoing, where we looked at climate change and the impacts of climate change from a social injustice point of view. And what we were able to do there was to identify different neighbourhoods across the whole of the UK, well, England, Scotland, Wales, where climate change was going to have a greater impact on more deprived communities. So what it does, I mean, you can map things like the impacts of climate change, what weather might look like, what temperature might look like, what rainfall might look like, and the impacts of flooding and heat stress up to say 2070 in the UK. And what we did was to then integrate that with population data and say, well, actually, those are people living in more deprived neighbourhoods across the UK are going to be much more severely impacted by climate change. Therefore, there's an environmental injustice based on essentially you're sorted geodemographically based on where you live, and for the lowest 10 and 20% area of the population with most deprivation, they tend to be close to areas which are more polluting. There's more flood risk. I mean, I'm sure many of you are here today have probably seen the news over the weekend. There's been flooding in communities across the UK, parts of Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, in England, and they are, and particularly in areas of Sheffield. And these are predominantly in more deprived neighbourhoods. And this isn't because of recent house building or recent policy. These are more areas of older housing. It tends to be smaller housing in inner city neighbourhoods that have been impacted by just events that have just happened this weekend. And there's no sign really of a lot of that changing. We may come back onto this later around sort of how we tackle some of this, but there is a lot of questions around what we call adaptive capacity. And again, it's another environmental injustice that people living in more deprived communities just do not have the financial resources to adapt. They probably don't even have insurance, for the things that they possess in their house. But I don't want to kind of preempt some of the earlier questions, but for me, I think this is all about, what is the evidence base? And we've got a lot of evidence, but it's about how we convince government and how we get more people involved in understanding the problem. I think a lot of people don't fully understand the impact of what climate change are going to be. We keep having these extreme weather events, and people get very confused with the idea of, we talk about 1 in 100-year flood events, and if it's it's happened twice in the last 5 years. Well, that's because the way in which we express how the impacts of extreme weather, I don't think we always use the best language as well. But I will stop there, because I could go off on all sorts of directions, and we need to keep on topic in terms of what your question.
Thank you, Richard. I think the examples you gave are exactly why this debate is so salient today. I mean, it's happened so recently, and I think it's just testament to how important this debate is, and we're so grateful to kind of be having this debate with you. Anastasia, how does your field define environmental injustice?
Well, I'm delighted that one of Richard's last words was language.
Oh, fantastic.
And I think you'd think we had rehearsed this, but we hadn't. But it just shows, really, it brings me back to the kind of interconnectedness of some of these issues, because part of what we struggle with in courses on writing, on language, on literature, is how to express, or rather how to read into other, authors' expressions of climate injustice, issues of sustainability, and all the injustices that might come with that. So what we tend to look at are ways in which this detail is harnessed into a kind of representative genres and forms. So how do novels, short stories, podcasts, talks, how do these forms find ways in which to deal with the impact of such enormous events that are sometimes unintelligible? And how do they try and capture the imagination? And I just have a very short quote from an author that we start the course with called Jonathan Safran Foer. It's a great book, We Are the Weather. And he has a really very poignant paragraph, which kind of gets me every time. So I'll try and hold it together. But he says, it's not an easy story to tell. The planetary crisis hasn't proved to be a good story. And he says it not only fails to convert us, it fails to interest us. Now, obviously not us on this call, but obviously it's a wider call for kind of broader society. To captivate and to transform are the most fundamental ambitions of activism and art, which is why climate change as subject matter fares so poorly in both realms. Now, I've kind of come to appreciate that comment, but also through reading kind of global literature that fundamentally and very actively and directly tackles these issues or ways in which to talk about them has taught me a lot. And so I'd just like to sort of come round to my point, which is that I feel that global literature's response to perhaps misleading discourses on resource underpins a lot of the literature. So we tend to kind of group the literature for students so as to emphasize elements of environmental injustice. So we have, group hydrofictions, petrofictions, deforestation fictions, indigenous knowledges, and we don't separate them that way always, but we want to show that the representation of climate injustice through impactful events has to also tell a good story and capture the imagination. And so we try and do as wide as possible an overview of different types of genres that try and tackle this. It's not always easy because the writers, you feel like you're always measuring them against what we might want to call evidence-based reality. And yet what they're trying to show is ways in which we can empathize, understand, and also differently inhabit these contexts and these situations. Stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you. I think it's so interesting to see kind of how your different fields intersect, the many ways in which they converge. And I think it's particularly interesting, you all kind of touched upon how the humanities at Manchester are kind of addressing these environmental injustices, which leads me fantastically onto my next question, which is kind of how is your field and indeed your department at the University of Manchester kind of addressing environmental injustice? What are kind of some of the steps they've taken in addressing this massive global harm?
You want me to start? Well, I mean, I think that we have a very well-respected community of researchers at the University of Manchester. I mean, we are globally recognized as one of as a leader in joining up research with tackling global sustainable development challenges. So I think I would, as a person who spends most of my time doing research, I would say that we just have to look across the School of Social Sciences, where I'm based, to see the diverse ways that different academics are framing the discussion, finding new and innovative ways of working with diverse communities. And really, I mean, from my perspective, I think that this idea of getting out of the university and into communities and working with communities in a kind of co-productive way to kind of help us as academics understand the challenges, as well as to, use our privileged position as academics to support the types of changes that communities want to make. And I'll only just speak for myself as and give an example of what I've been working on since I moved to Manchester. So I've been in Manchester now for about 7 years. Before that, I worked at Keele University, and before that, I'm from Toronto originally. And I've always been interested in how to use my kind of position as a researcher to sort of enable and facilitate conversations in communities. So what I've been doing since I moved to Manchester is I've been working in the sort of community south of the university, immediately south of the university, to help local grassroots organizations understand why are areas like Rusholme and Mosside such a kind of mess. I mean, if anyone who's a student at the University of Manchester who might walk through these neighborhoods would see that they are quite underserved. There's a lot of rubbish. There's a lot of, sort of unsightly kind of environmental conditions, let's call it. And so the first thing I did is I tried to help them understand what what was the cause. And through that, to try to shine a light on the fact that these environmental conditions close to the university are not necessarily the fault of individuals. There's all kinds of complex factors, social, political, economic, cultural, for the way that these neighborhoods look the way they look. And so that is, in a way, is a real, as I said before, about challenging assumptions, because often there's an assumption, especially with stigmatized communities, that they are somehow hard to reach or uninterested in environmental issues. And often when you get involved with local people, local activists and local organizations, you find out that actually nobody has asked them for their views on their own local environmental quality. So I've been really sort of inspired by that kind of work. I've gone on to sort of work with members of communities that live in those areas south of the university, who've come from countries of the global north, who have migrated from countries like Pakistan and Somalia that are extremely climate challenged, people who've been living through the climate emergency for decades and have relocated to live pretty much on the doorstep of our university, and have incredible knowledge, experience, and political, wisdom, environmental wisdom that is rarely captured and rarely listened to and rarely heard. So that's one of the things that I've been doing, which I think is a kind of, part of the kind of commitment to engage scholarship and co-production, which is so important in the humanities and social sciences. And there's so many other examples within the University of Manchester and within our faculty of doing that. I hope that's a good answer to your question. There's so many other things I could talk about, but that's what came to mind.
Definitely. I think this is the kind of debate where you could just keep talking for hours. It's such an interesting and very important debate to be having. And I think students will definitely understand your point about Rusholme. I mean, students live there for perhaps maybe 2 years at most. And it's really about those communities who have no choice but to live here, despite causing none of the harms themselves. So I think that's a really, really important point that you brought up. Thank you so much. Richard, how about you? How does your field kind of tackle environmental justice?
Yes, I suppose as a Department of Planning and Property Environmental Management, we're quite applied. All our degree programs are professionally accredited by Royal Town Planning Institute, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. Our other one, I think, is the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management. So we've always had sort of quite an applied focus and try to look at. Oh, my phone is ringing. Hold on. Not what you want in the middle of one of these. So quite an applied approach to things, trying to come up with solutions. We work closely with local government, national government. We used to work with the European Commission. Hopefully we'll be starting working with them again soon, with recent changes to research funding. And actually, I always remember a former colleague of mine who now works in New Zealand, who was a geographer who came to planning, and he always used to say, planning's sort of like geography with purpose. So we kind of go beyond just looking, analysing and understanding things, to actually try and come up with a solution. Now, geography has changed over the years, and it's probably it's a bit more geography with a purpose as well now in terms of coming up with solutions. So I think, it's about, well, not just tackling a problem or understanding a problem purely for academic pursuit, really. It's to work with those people on the ground who are trying to come up with solutions. So an example of that is like, I keep referring to this Joseph Rowntree Foundation work, where we wrote, as well as doing the evidence base and analysing the data, we also came up with policy solutions. So what can communities do to adapt, and what's what we might call adaptive capacity? So what is the capacity within that community to actually make changes for themselves? And how do you work with, and as Sherilyn's been saying, how do you work with those communities and engage them to help solve those problems? Or maybe not entirely solving them themselves, but getting them better connected with local politicians, with decision makers, whether that's being the local council, the Environment Agency, DEFRA, to make sure that, where money's being spent. I mean, again, coming back to the news this weekend, I forget which community, somewhere in Lincolnshire, the local MP is now summoning the Environment Agency saying you spent £8 million back in 2017 on a flood defence system, and our whole village town is now flooded. What's gone wrong? Now, I guess at the time, probably very few people in that community were involved in discussions with the Environment Agency about how that £8 million was being spent on those flood defences. So I think there's lots that need to be done about how do you bring these different communities together. I mean, for me personally, obviously, it's about what some might call sort of a data-driven approach. How can we use data to create the evidence base and what we call evidence-based policy making to inform and better inform decisions? If we look, for example, at coastal communities, a lot of coastal communities on the east coast of the UK are under threat of tidal surges and sea level rise. So thinking about what conversations do we need to start having with those communities? And a lot of politicians don't want to have the conversations about, in 2050, what will the coast of Lincolnshire look like if we allow the seawater to encroach and do what we call managed retreat, allowing just nature to take over in a way. But that has huge implications. It has implications for where people live, where people work, and it's not just a straightforward thing of saying, well, where are we going to move all these people to? Where will they live in the future? And it's conversations that are now starting to happen in places like Hull. That comes out as one of the worst places in the UK in our analysis for environmental injustice in terms of the impacts of sea level rise and river flooding as well. When you've got river water coming down from one side, down the River Aire, the River Calder, the Humber, and you've also got tidal surge. It's a perfect storm, really, of two things coming together. And then, how we work with politicians and decision makers about where investment goes. We can't build a huge concrete wall all down the east coast of England to stop this happening. So I think it's coming up with those policy solutions, working with communities to try and solve the problem. And whilst I'm talking a lot here about the UK, I've got other colleagues both in my department but across our faculty and other parts of the university that are looking at this on a global context as well. So within SEED, we have something called the Global Development Institute. They look at a lot of this in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. So although I'm kind of relating this to my experience of working mainly in the UK and Europe, we do look at this and think of how this works in other parts of the world. But a really important thing there is, if we look at the global north versus the global south, is not just to make the assumption that the ideas that work here in the west, in the global north, can be implemented and applied in the global south. And there are ways in which we can learn from other parts of the world as well. There's a whole set of literature on something called policy mobilities, and it's got nothing to do with travel. The word mobility is there. It's about how do ideas that are generated in one location, one city, one region translate to another. And there's an example I always use is what's called the Barcelona model. By model, I don't mean a physical model of the city. It's a process to how Barcelona reinvented itself during the early 90s when it hosted the Olympics. Before that, people didn't go on holiday to Barcelona. You didn't go on a weekend city break there. You didn't go on a family holiday to Barcelona. It turned its back to the sea. It had no beach. Anyway, I could go on for ages about this, but the point about this, though, is that when the UK government in the late 90s tried to take the Barcelona model and implement it in the UK, it didn't work. The idea of having, cafe culture and a more of a nighttime economy, it initially did not work out because the reason it worked in Barcelona was you had a mayor with a lot of power, an elected mayor with lots of power who could make decisions and make things happen. Now, 25, 30 years later, we're now doing that. Manchester, Greater Manchester's got a mayor. West Yorkshire, our city regions have mayors who are directly elected and can make decisions. So a lot of these things, the way in which we do things in one part of the world doesn't always directly apply in another, and it can take decades for this kind of thing to change. So it's not easy, and we're looking at long timelines to implement a lot of these things.
Thank you so much, Richard. It was really kind of fascinating to hear you chart the difference between a top-down approach versus a bottom-up, more kind of data-informed by the communities approach. And I think especially your point about Barcelona, it's so true that one size does not fit all. And indeed, it's exactly why we brought your three different fields together, as there is no one way of really kind of tackling environmental injustice. And it's why it's particularly pertinent to this debate to recognize that one size does not fit all, and that there will be many different ways in which this harm can be tackled. And from that, I will lead on to Anastasia. Kind of, how does your field tackle environmental injustice?
Well, I'll tell you a little story before I answer that, which is that, again, Richard has inspired me to tell you of something that happened to me a few days ago. We are currently hosting a very large conference on the history of the short story in Manchester. And I went to a wonderful plenary on Monday afternoon, and a writer from the northwest of England, who's based at the University of Kiel, which I believe Sherilyn said she was part of, is writing a short story on Fairbourne, which is the coastal village which is being eroded, and is trying to sort of narrativize this idea of somewhere that is going to disappear. I think Fairbourne, if I understood it correctly, is going to be decommissioned in 27 years. That's as long as they believe it has, until it will actually be taken over again and return to its, for want of a better word, natural a context. Richard may know a little bit about this. So in a sense, I'm thinking about where do we get our knowledge from, and how do we kind of process it? And there are different ways from which, I mean, this is where I got that knowledge from. I mean, and I remembered I'd read something in The Guardian and forgotten about it. So I think, where do we get our knowledge from? So just kind of coming back to our school, arts, languages, and cultures, I would say that we're trying to embed where we see stories, we're trying to embed them into courses, we're trying to allow them to feed the structuring and the putting together, in a sense, of curriculum. So particularly in English, we do start from level 1 and through to MA. So where possible, we want to introduce students to the kind of language of environmental injustice, to the language of climate crisis, so that we have a shared base. Not that there can't be debate and fluctuation, but so there's a shared element of understanding upon which you can then build proper conversations and proper interventions. So I'd say that's one of the things we do. The other thing that we do is we're very careful about how we incorporate certain types of terminology. And I come here to things like, for example, scarcity, or the idea of reciprocity. And these, for me and for a lot of our students, are very vague terms and can be used in many different ways. So then we kind of harness the tools of the literature that's available to us, the stories, the cultural production elements that are available to us, in order to try and build a kind of common ground, as I said earlier. So all the time we're looking for ways in which environmental injustice is being represented, is being understood, and is generating images, whether they're set in the past, whether they're set in the present or the future. And I can talk about genre later, but it's about forming an imaginary space, as it were, where a lot of issues can be, you know, it's difficult. I don't want to say experience, but we can inhabit situations that may often seem inconceivable. As Richard and Sherilyn have been saying, things that maybe happen elsewhere for which we may not have an immediate understanding of. Certainly the way that we try and incorporate it in teaching is to allow a certain degree of understanding and empathy. So of course you cannot be in the shoes of, but you can certainly try and approximate some of the issues that might contribute to that situation. And I think environmental injustice lends itself, I'd say it's very difficult to represent. There's a wonderful kind of treatise written by the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, where he says there is no such thing as good representation of environmental injustice and climate crisis. You cannot write such a thing. And then he himself went and tried to write one, a wonderful novel called Gun Island. And that attempt, I won't go into it now, but in trying to talk about environmental injustice, what actually ends up happening for Ghosh is that he talks about all forms of injustice: gendered injustice, racial injustice, injustice at a kind of many different forms, and shows how they intersect very well. And I believe that's something that literature and other forms of cultural representation can do very well. They can give an immediacy through this kind of intersectional approach. So I'd say that's the kind of thing we're doing. Lastly, I would say that we're trying also not to make everything about the present and about the contemporary moment. And of course, if you're doing a course in culture and literature, especially in our department, we have a commitment to starting from the Anglo-Saxon period to the present. So I think a lot of colleagues are trying to embed many of these issues and many of these questions into their teaching right across the board. And I think that's very good. I can talk a little bit later about my own personal research and how that intersects with issues of environmental injustice. Thanks.
Again, that was kind of so fascinating to hear. I think you're completely right. Literature and cultural production gives such a nuanced view to this issue, in that just through the creation of images, and you can look at them retrospectively in the past as well, understand what people thought in the past. And as you said, it really is important in giving those underrepresented communities a voice. Language is the most accessible thing we have in this world. And so where they lack power and perhaps institutional structures, that kind of thing, their language comes into play, and exactly how we can understand how diverse communities kind of view this issue and how they are indeed addressing it. So thank you so much, Anastasia. Now that we've all kind of talked about how we are indeed addressing environmental injustice, what would you say in your fields are perhaps the greatest challenges when it comes to addressing these injustices?
Okay, well, I think I'd probably start with recognizing that discussions of injustice are not the dominant narrative within the politics of the environment. And I think there's a kind of, what is dominant is perhaps a kind of optimism about technological solutions, and that we sort of know what needs to be done. Technology and climate science and environmental science kind of has the answers, and people just need to then follow in line. So there's also not only a kind of focus on technological solutions, but also an individual focus on behavior, and a whole kind of interest in behavior change and individual behavior change and individual responsibility, both of which are very insensitive to diversity, difference, and inequality. So in many, I've heard the slogan that, we all talk about a just transition. The transition part is what a lot of the sort of, science and STEM subject kind of can help with, and say that a transition out of, a fossil-based energy system is inevitable. We have to do that. Whether or not it will be just is very much up for debates, and it's going to be very much a political struggle to see whether our transition will be, in fact, fair and just to the majority of people that live on the planet. The second thing I would say is that another kind of dominant narrative that maybe might come from outside of the sort of formal sort of techno-science and STEM fields is a kind of maybe a kind of environmentalist perspective that tries to think that we're all in this together. So the whole species as a big blob are kind of in peril on the planet. So maybe if you might have heard the idea of the Anthropocene. Many people have said that that's quite a valuable concept, that we are living in the age of humans, that as humans have, as a species, have impacted the climate and the environment to the point of peril. And others have said, well, that whole notion of a kind of, human age of humans is really problematic, because it doesn't recognize that the historic inequalities, the systems that, the sort of the historic debt from colonialism, extractivist approaches that have kind of shaped the world that we have, where very few people have benefited, and many people are still paying the price and will pay the price. So that kind of issue of that kind of narrative of Anthropocene, and we're all in this together, and there's no time for thinking about difference in democracy, that is kind of a big challenge, and that it prevents the focus on calling out the most responsible, holding to account those who have created the loss and the damage that the majority of the people on the planet are facing with, and therefore need to be compensated for. So for me, those big narratives are challenging. I would say one more challenge, I think, when it comes down to, trying to tackle, let's just look at the UK, sort of with those huge global challenges, and we haven't talked possibly enough about the big issues of global climate injustice, but certainly at the UK level of the UK, we desperately need, to diversify the conversation about climate challenges and environmental challenges. But when we look at the field of environmental, say environmental sectors, environmental organizations, professionals, decision makers, it's overwhelmingly white, right? The environmental sector is the least diverse sector in the UK after farming, right? There's been a recent report last year by that has found that just 7% of people working in environmental sector identify as people of color, racially and ethnically minoritized. That's a tiny minority of people who bring, who can bring the knowledge, the expertise, the arguments to try and help diversify the sector. It's just so overly white and middle class that it possibly doesn't resonate. Environmental arguments may not resonate with a broad, a broad diversity of population in the UK. So I think that is a huge challenge and needs to be addressed. And I think we need to actually call it out more and recognize it as a problem.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think I completely agree. It's very important to recognize the different political agents at play, because after all, policy is the main driver in environmental injustice and how we respond to that as a nation. So it's very important to kind of bring a diverse community of voices into play into the political landscape. Thank you so much, Sherilyn. Richard, how about you?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and whilst Sherilyn was talking, and it took me back to why I'm sat in the university and not sat in some local authority somewhere in England, where I started my career. And it's policy, people and politics, I think, 3 Ps. And the reason I'm here was I got extremely frustrated as a junior planner, having done many years at university, studying, to then go into a job with my professionally accredited degrees to then get told by councillors, elected officials, that they weren't going forward with what us as professionals were recommending. So I got a job in a university, and I guess it's we've got the technology, and we've got the evidence, and we've got a lot of solutions, but when it comes to policy and politics, we're not taking the right decisions. And despite lots of well-intentioned people with loud voices, and as I say, the evidence, it's there. And I know colleagues who work in certain central government departments who are extremely frustrated at the moment. We've just had a big shift in net zero policy over the last few weeks, and are literally tearing their hair out over some of the decisions that have been made by elected politicians that still don't seem to be convinced that we've got a major catastrophe on its already happening. So for me, it's I think all we can really do is keep producing the evidence, keep making recommendations, pushing for this, and hopefully eventually things will start to change. But we're in a pretty dire situation at the moment, and certainly the English government, I have to be careful here because there's a lot of devolved responsibilities in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but certainly the Westminster Parliament are not heading in the right direction at the moment. I mean, the things around net zero, I could go on a complete rant about electric vehicles, which are not the future, in the sense that still having everyone in an individual vehicle, just because it's not polluting at that particular location as it drives down the street, doesn't mean that's solving the problem. It's still generating lots of resource, so having lots of the motor industry trying to convince them all that we should all drive around in Teslas and other electric vehicles is not the solution either. But there are lots of vested interests there that influence politics as well. But I will stop going off on a rant.
I think your final point about the electric vehicles was really, really important, and especially kind of with us being in such a dire situation, we can't afford the time to retrospectively go back and be like, oh, maybe that wasn't the right policy to take at that time. So I think, as you said, evidence-based approaches are completely the way forward, and exactly why your field is so important to this particular debate. Thank you so much. Anastasia, what about you? What kind of challenges are you finding in addressing environmental injustice in your field?
Sure. Thank you, Zara. I'm going to just follow on from some things Sherilyn was saying. And I'd say that in the field of literature, I'm a post-colonialist, that's my training. And so always looking to try and understand how you can decenter knowledge. And it's very important in this context to try and decenter knowledge without using words such as we need to learn from, we need to embed alternative knowledges, we need to use. No, we don't need to do any of these things or even incorporate them. We just need to have a level playing field where what is useful, we need to get it from anywhere and however it's written and wherever it comes from. And so, but it is difficult because if you're trying to promote within our particular, perhaps for want of a better word, Eurocentric setting, if you're trying to promote alternative forms of knowledge that come from alternative traditions, wisdom traditions that are interested in terms such as, custodianship, stewardship of the land, then again, that's another learning curve. But I think that's really, it's a challenge, but it's also a very important thing that we really need to incorporate without, and I really have to stress this, without then putting the burden of responsibility in a sense on those communities to have to continually kind of show I'm here as well. So it's about trying to find a way. And I have to say, and I won't give examples now, but there are plenty of really good examples in literature where this is done. And I also have to point out it's incredibly dense and difficult. And that's what it should be. But it's very, very rich and very enriching in terms of different ways of thinking about land distribution, stewardship of land, and understanding of environmental justice and real, very, very inspired models for the future are embedded. I used the word embedded, I didn't mean to, are present there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating to hear about kind of how the research at the University of Manchester and indeed you individually as academics have been contributing to this issue. Kind of now turning the focus towards students who might be in the chat. How would you suggest, what kind of fields or kind of jobs are there that students might be able to get into to address these issues after maybe taking a course with your department?
Well, just, really briefly, I would sort of think about working in public services, so local councils and civil service to try to influence service provision and policy change. Maybe things like community development, where, there's a role to help empower and enable local people to find their own solutions. There was a really good article in the Guardian this morning about the need for left behind communities to be not worked, for or with, but actually hand over power and capacity to local communities to do their own kinds of developments. I think things like research organizations and think tanks. And I would love to say working in urban planning, because that's where I started back as an undergraduate. I wanted to be an urban planner in Canada way back. And I think, I don't know what the profession is like these days, but if there's a potential for planners to make real on the ground change, that would be a wonderful profession to go into. But Richard might have a different view.
Well, I think it's changed since my experience, which is kind of 25 years ago. And certainly our students, whether they're doing urban planning, environmental management, we have a new master's course with geography on green infrastructure and climate change. A lot of our students go off into local government, but national government as well, the Environment Agency, international students going and working for the UN, the European Commission. So there were those sort of global kind of quangos, non-governmental organizations, as well as going, working in governments from where maybe if you come from abroad, going back to your country and working in your government. But yeah, there's a heck of a lot of environmental consultancies. And actually in Manchester, after London, I remember when I was admissions tutor, I was used to, after London, there were more planning, environmental consultancies in Manchester than any other city across the UK. So yeah, a lot of opportunities and in research as well. I'm leading a big research program at the moment. I've got 15 staff working for me on that. Some of them are environmental scientists. So there's a lot of opportunities within this kind of research community as well.
Sure, sorry. Well, right. We need good stories. We need good narratives. Write short stories. Write film scripts. write. TV, good TV drama. I met a banker. I can't believe I'm using these words, but I met a banker on a train in the summer, traveling from Zurich to Paris, and he said the UK is such a great producer of drama. That is one of their biggest assets. I did not expect a banker from Zurich to tell me this, but it is noticed, it is noticeable. And I think that's got to be our big strength. Also, of course, teaching. Also, as Sherilyn said, community development is something we very much prioritize. And as Richard said, of course, researcher. There's plenty to do in environmental humanities and energy humanities. And I think there should hopefully be plenty of jobs in those areas as we start to need them more and more. We've always needed them, but now we really need them. So hopefully. And there's a lovely question in the chat about reading lists. I'm happy to share any reading list anybody wants, anytime.
Thank you, all of you. I think it's great that you mentioned that, the humanities are such a great output for jobs in the environmental sector. Our courses really embed sustainability into them. And so, yeah, hopefully we will prepare any prospective students with the skills they need to be successful in a career in any environmental related field. I think that's all we have time for in terms of discussion. We do have some questions in the chat now, though, so I will just read them out. And if you wouldn't mind answering them. So yeah, the first one you touched on, can you recommend any readings for me to learn more about these issues in your fields?
Well, just in the interest of time, I would say there's so much research and so much in academic publishing that you can look at, and obviously a Google Scholar search will find. The journal that I edit called Environmental Politics, I would recommend as a place to go for the political dimensions of environmental injustice and the struggle for justice. And then I would just give a couple of really quick recommendations of recent policy reports that you could have a look at. The Runnymede Trust worked with Greenpeace to publish a report called Confronting Injustice, Racism and the Climate Emergency. And you can get that on the Runnymede Trust website. And then there's the Racial Action for the Climate Emergency, which is the 2002 called RACE report. And that was put together by a consortium of groups from the Hindu Climate Action, Nature Youth Connection, South Asians for Sustainability, and a really interesting organization that students should have a look at, which is called Students Organizing for Sustainability. So www.sos.uk.org. And they also have a lot of tips and advice and suggestions for what students can do to get involved in the campaign for environmental and climate justice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you can pass this on, but for those of us presenting, we're on Zoom, and I've just posted a link. I don't know whether or not there's a way of getting that out to everyone who's watching, but there's an organisation called the Town and Country Planning Association, which started off in the 19th century, and one of their campaign areas is all around climate change, and I work with them on a lot of this. But there's a lot of accessible materials on their website. It's sort of a mixture of academic and policy focused, but a lot of it is freely accessible. Students can become members for I think about £10, and you get a monthly kind of glossy journal for that. So some really good material on there. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of our live reading lists. I mean, I teach a module called Future Cities, and I'm sure that the reading list there is publicly available, but it may be material that can make it available. But the kind of such a long list, it's difficult to know where to start.
Yeah, rather than a quick list, I think I might just suggest to people who perhaps, different forms of digesting material, that The Guardian often hosts some and other organizations, of course, host some, I don't work for The Guardian, host some very good talks. And I went to a wonderful one recently that had 3 speakers, one of whom was George Monbiot, and it was about trying to link, the climate and the rising anti-immigration agenda, which brought a whole other discussion when it comes to environmental justice and the impact of that. So I would say, have your reading list, but kind of also look around to see what other forms are engaging with these issues.
Fantastic. Maybe one more question, as we're just worried that it might cut off for the live stream. So with such an oversaturated space, what ways can we try to stand out as individuals who want to contribute to change?
I would say join forces with others, work collectively. There's lots of individuals who want to be influencers and get attention to themselves. I'd say put your energies into working collectively to help support political change as part of a debate and changing the debate. Perhaps joining a campaigning organization, getting students involved, your own peers and colleagues, getting them involved in trying to promote the justice side of the just transition.
Yeah, to add to that as well, I would say volunteering. We have one of my colleagues runs something called the Tree Musketeers. And they go out and do environmental conservation work with local groups across Greater Manchester and around the region. And it's certainly something employers look for on CVs. With not having some environmental type conservation volunteering on your CV, I think for a lot of those sort of climate change charities, Plangos and things, that's what they would expect to see on a CV.
Yeah, spread good stories. There was a fantastic one last week, I think, or the week before, from an Italian academic who is a climate scientist working in Papua New Guinea, and he doesn't fly and he refused to go back when his employer said, you must be back in 3 days. It takes him 35 days, I think, to get back overland. And he just said no, and they fired him. I think spread these stories around. So he's not sure if when he gets back, he'll have a job. So I think that's a very kind of, just if you find stories that are kind of inspiring, share them with others and spread the word.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for kind of being here today, giving your time and speaking so passionately about what is really such an important issue to be talked about. So thank you so much for your time. I'm sure everybody really, really enjoyed all of your inputs, and it's been so interesting to kind of hear how your fields intersect and indeed the ways they might even diverge from one another. So thank you so much for your time.